Today I'm sharing a slightly different type of video than what I've been posting on my channel recently. This week I decided to resume a VR game project that I've been working on in bits and pieces on and off for a while now. And in this video, I'll share my process for how I'm designing this game level and then pull everything into Unity to test it out in VR. So one of my initial steps when creating this level started back in the design phase of this game. During the time that I was nailing down the idea for this game, the genre, what it was going to be about, what my game loop was going to be that the player was going to interact with to get to the conclusion of the game, and a whole bunch of other stuff. But just to keep the focus of this video on designing this level, I'll just say that one of the initial steps was to take an inventory of everything that needed to be in this room and sketch out the room to get an idea of what it would look like. Then I opened up Blender and began by blocking out the level using cubes that I scaled down to the actual dimensions of the models that I planned to be in the room. And blocking out the room was pretty beneficial for me for a couple of reasons. First, it helped me get a visual representation in the 3D space of what this room could look like, and it helped me get an idea about the scale of everything and the room around it. And also, blocking out the room helped me make some decisions about where things were going to go and what areas of the room needed more or less based on how I was positioning all of the items in the room. And my next step was to go one by one through each of these blocks and replace them with the actual model that I would be using in the room. The first thing I modeled was the foundation of the room, so just the 4 walls, floor, and ceiling. And then I also cut out the door and window, and then I added a little bit of detail with the baseboards and added some trim around the door and window. And then I got to modeling each of the items and placing them in the room where I wanted them to go. And my thought process for this was I'm still in a prototype phase for this game, so my focus at this time is really just to get things modeled and not try to be too precious about everything. So this is mostly just a first pass that I can use to pull it into Unity, test it in VR, and have kind of like a checkpoint for how I'm thinking everything's coming together so far before moving on to details like texturing or putting any polish on. And I actually modeled these quite a while ago. So this week I'm just trying to pick back up where I left off and review each model, where I'm at with it, and make some decisions. Does it need to be remodeled, or can I just clean up a little bit of the geometry to get them to be a little bit lower poly before I place them in Unity? And so to do this, I'm just going to adjust any of my modifiers and turn down some of the intensity of anything that's creating a ton of extra geometry, or try to see if I can achieve geometry in lower poly ways, such as switching out a subdivision subsurface modifier, which creates a lot of geometry everywhere, and see if I can replace that with a bevel modifier, where it's just smoothing out the edges of the model, so it's just creating a little bit of geometry some places. For a couple of these models, I decided to redo them or add some things, like I didn't even have a door or a door handle and things like that. So I did actually take the time to model those today for the visual test in VR. I should probably mention that this is going to be a VR puzzle game. And all of the items that are going into this level are typical items you'd see in a living room interior. They're pretty standard items, but every item is actually going to be part of a puzzle in this game, which is pretty intentional. There are some items that are not yet in the scene that I've been working on, such as the puzzle inputs. But for right now, I'm just working on the environment and the props that are in the level. One of the things that I was keeping in mind when modeling everything in this level was where the player's perspective could be at any time. And in VR, there's an extra layer here because the player may or may not be able to stick their heads in places that are different from a typical mouse and keyboard or other controller type game. In VR, you can set up 2 different modes. One is where you just use the joystick to move around, so you're attached to the character controller in-game. The other way is using room setup, where you can actually walk around your own play space, and that translates to you walking around the game. But you can actually drift away from the character controller that's set up in the game that might have colliders on it. So the player can actually travel away from where you intend for them to go because they can walk past things that would otherwise be blocked from the character controller, which has colliders on it. So while modeling this, I was thinking about what parts of the mesh the player can or can't see based on how they might be interacting with the game. And that can drive decisions about which parts of the model that you want to have rendered by the game engine. And this is really just a factor for the player's immersion. And a player sticking their head through things is probably not going to be giving them immersion, but at least if they do stick their head farther than you and expect them to, like looking behind the bookshelf, for example, there will actually be a back to the bookshelf for their immersion. I assume that people watching this video are mostly going to be people who have played video games before. And I'm kind of curious, what kind of gamer are you in terms of, do you like to run around in games and try to break everything and explore all the nooks and crannies and jump on everything and like be wild? Or are you a little bit more subdued and seem to stay in the bounds of the items in the room? When I was exporting these models, I was grouping them into static or dynamic type of models. And I'm thinking that the static models are going to be things that just need a collider on them, and they're not going to have any like added functionality for the player, like being able to like pick them up or performing any actions. So I just exported all of the static objects together for now. And then for all of the individual objects that the player will be like picking up and using and will need functionality for the game attached to them, theirs are going to have to be separate models in the game. But for right now, I'm just exporting all of the dynamic objects together just for the purposes of a visual test in VR. So now everything's modeled and I'm ready to export them and pull them into Unity. I added a transparent material to the window for now and just set up some temporary lighting just so that I could see, but this isn't like the lighting that's going to be in the game. That's going to be like a whole other step. And then I'm going to test in VR. So a few initial thoughts. First thing I noticed right away was that some of the assets have the backsides of their faces showing. So basically, the game engine by default only renders the front side of faces. For example, if I model a cube, I don't need the game engine to also render what's happening inside of the cube because the player's not going to see that. So I'm going to have to change this and make sure I add some back faces back to these plants. I removed them when I was trying to clean up extra geometry to see if I could get away without having any back faces on them, but it's clear to me that I'll probably need to add these for immersion. And I also see the same thing happening on the lamp. This is one of those examples of like where your player's camera is going to be. If my player was at a set height playing this game, like if it was a non-VR game, I wouldn't really need to render this underside of the lamp. But since the player can bend down in their VR headset, they will be able to see that. So I'm going to have to fix that as well. And I'm just going to go around the room and pretend to interact with everything because it's not hooked up yet, just to kind of remind myself how everything might be used and pull out anything else that might be weird about this space. The other thing I noticed is that like the scaling of the objects looks okay to me, but the actual scale of the room in relation to the objects just feels off. I definitely think that this room needs to be a bit smaller for these objects to look like they fit a little bit better here. So I'm going to go back into Unity and fix that issue with the back faces showing. I'm just going to add the solidify modifier to the objects for all three of the plants, leaves, and then also the lamp. I also tried looking to see if there was a way to easily turn on and off backface culling for certain objects in Unity. I actually tried out a few different methods, but none of them were working for me. So I just modeled the back sides of the faces for now. If there is an actual way to do this in Unity that's not super complex, please let me know in the comments so I can do that. But otherwise, I'll just add the faces with actual geometry. All right, so that looks a lot better. I think that nothing's like disappearing anymore, which is great. So now you can see the underside of the leaves. And then let's check out this lamp as well. Yeah, I think this one looks a lot better too. So I'm pretty happy with that. And I did change the size of the room too. I made it a bit smaller so that the furniture doesn't feel so far away from each other. And I think this might be a bit better for VR players who use room setup because they won't have to travel as far to get to different parts of the room. The rest of the items seem okay, and yeah. So I think next I'm ready for some of the next steps where I start actually hooking up these models to some of the functionality in Unity and just check that out to make sure that the way that these models look works for the functionality that I have planned for them. And then I can make some more changes to the models if necessary. And then once I know everything's the right size, I've tested it out visually and also functionally, I think I'll be ready to texture them and then also start working on like the post-processing and lighting for this room. So anyway, I hope you enjoyed taking a peek into my workflow and my thoughts about this VR game project that I've been working on. And if you'd like to hear about another update, let me know in terms of the design and also the functionality of not only the puzzles themselves, but also just like setting up VR in Unity. So if you have any questions or you'd like me to cover a specific topic on this game project, let me know in the comments. Otherwise, I hope you're doing well. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.